Plan. We want to thank our panelists today, Claire Elias, candidate for a master's in environmental management with the Duke University. And this summer, Claire served in a Stanback Fellowship with Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy, focusing on creating this climate change action plan for us. And we're so grateful to the Stanback family and to Duke University for enabling us to have world-class scholars and activists like Claire here with the organization to create things of great benefit for our work, like this climate change action plan. And also want to recognize Marquette Crockett on our staff, Roan Stewardship Director, and Angela Shepard, our communications director with SAHC, who supervised and worked with Claire this past summer. So climate and climate change are so impactful and potentially damaging to the landscape in the Southern Appalachian Mountains, and mitigating the effects of climate change is integral to our work. And so we're thrilled today to be able to share Claire's presentation, in which she will discuss the specifics of how land trust work and Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy's work help mitigate those impacts. So we'll go through the webinar, and if you have questions, and I'm sure many of you will, please feel free to type those into the Q&A or the chat, and we'll try to answer your questions as they come along. And maybe we'll have time at the end also to answer questions too. Also, this presentation will be posted online and will be available at our website in a day or two. So thank you very much. And thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Carl. So I guess I'll just go ahead and jump right in. So thanks everyone for coming to my climate change action plan presentation. I'll start with just a little bit more about me. I'm a second year MEM student at the Nicholas School at Duke, focusing on ecosystem science and conservation. I'm originally from New York City, and I studied geology in undergrad. And before going back to graduate school, I worked as an environmental consultant in New York. A little bit why I chose this internship. First, I was motivated to complete a project focusing on climate change. It's an overwhelming and scary topic, so there were aspects of this research that were quite daunting. But I believe that climate anxiety, or the fear of learning about these issues, is a powerful tool for learning how we can fight climate change and for mobilizing others to do the same. Second, I wanted to explore how on-the-ground conservation practices, such as those carried out by local land management organizations, play into effective climate action. I also wanted to explore how we can protect the nature that immediately surrounds our communities, and not only how we can better protect this nature, but also how we can more greatly recognize how much it serves us and how important it is to our lives. Skills-wise, I also love to write, and I wanted a writing-intensive project that spanned both the human and natural dimensions of climate change. Lastly, I wanted to work with a land trust and learn all the ins and outs of voluntary conservation. I had learned a great deal about land trusts from my professors and classmates, and I wanted to use the summer to gain some firsthand experience, especially with SAHC, which is a land trust that's made such a significant impact on its region of focus with its such diverse approaches. My takeaways, first of all, land trusts are amazing. I loved working with SAHC and its incredible people. I could go on for a very long time about this, but I won't here. Maybe ask me later. I also love learning all about the natural and cultural history of the Southern Appalachians. I had the privilege of staying in the Roan Highlands in Asheville for 2 weeks to work in person with SAHC, where I learned more about the day-to-day at a land trust. And I also got to stay at Little Rock Creek Preserve, which is in the Roan Highlands. Doing so much reading and writing greatly improved my scientific communication skills, which in the life of a scientist is an essential and frankly underrated skill. especially when it comes to a topic as complex and daunting as climate change. Next, I want to talk a little bit about why land trusts and climate change. Climate change is a global issue that manifests in localized ways. Across the world, different environments and the communities that live among them, all of these places face varying challenges that require different conservation planning strategies. And local or regional knowledge is crucial to knowing what these challenges are. As community-facing organizations, land trusts are uniquely positioned to plan for climate change by leveraging the potential of voluntary conservation. In other words, working directly with landowners and other local stakeholders. This is especially pertinent in the Southern Appalachians, where over 80% of land is privately owned. Moreover, the work of land trusts is inevitably affected by climate change because climate change is rapidly transforming the ecosystems and landscapes that land trusts are working to protect. Meaningful conservation and stewardship therefore means anticipating these changes and planning for them. Along with other local land management organizations and agencies, land trusts are more familiar with local environmental needs and issues than, say, federal and state agencies and programs, although these programs do certainly have their place. As the world changes, local and regional land management organizations can contribute to climate solutions informed by unique ecological and social contexts. So, getting more to the organization and purpose of this document, it serves as an internal resource for SAHC staff, board members, AmeriCorps staff, and interns. It will inform SAHC's efforts to better communicate climate change through its ongoing work, such as donor communications and public outreach like volunteer work and hikes. Much of the work that SAHC does inherently contributes to climate change action. So there's now a question of how best to highlight the importance of SAHC's historical work in the context of climate change. So with that, I aim to answer 4 central questions. First, what does climate change look like in the Southern Appalachians? What kinds of changes are we going to see in our ecosystems and built environments? Second, how has SAHC's land protection and stewardship work thus far played into climate change planning, namely adaptation, mitigation, and resilience? Third, what steps is SAHC currently taking to intentionally address climate change? And finally, going forward, what steps can be taken to further build upon this work? This action plan is a living document, meaning that over time it will be revisited and revised according to changes in climate research, best practices, and SAHC's strategic planning goals. In the coming months, parts of this document will also be adapted for public use on the SAHC website. So you will be able to see a public-facing version of this information in the near future. I know Angela is working very hard on that right now. This is the general outline of the action plan. All in all, the report body is around 30 pages. There's also a section containing resources for further reading, a glossary, and some maps that visually communicate the different climate-centric conservation values of SAHC's protected lands. So with that, just go ahead and dive right in. Starting with climate change impacts to different ecosystems and environments throughout the Southern Appalachians. I'll start with changes in the precipitation regime and hydrology of the region, because hydrology underlies so much else that comprises Southern Appalachian landscapes. As the atmosphere continues to warm, the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere will also continue to increase. This additional water vapor then becomes available to increase heavy rainfall events. The 2020 North Carolina Climate Science Report has observed an increase in extreme precipitation events across the state, and it's predicted that the number of annual extreme precipitation events will increase, including in the mountains. And an extreme precipitation event means that you'll see an average of over 3 or more inches of precipitation within an hour. Dry periods and drought are natural occurrences in the Southern Appalachians, but it's anticipated that these dry periods and drought will become more intense as temperatures continue to rise. So this intense pendulum swing, one that vacillates between drought and downpours, will have considerable consequences for forest health, watershed hydrology, and flooding. For example, recent research has shown that drought-stressed ridgetop forests tend to consume more water when it's available, and this decreases overland flow and the availability of water for downstream areas. Aside from this precipitation regime change, rising temperatures are also reflected in southern Appalachian rivers, and this holds implications for thermally sensitive species like the Appalachian brook trout, which need really cold river temperatures in order to survive. Moving on to forests, which are super intertwined with these changes in hydrology. And forests are incredibly important. They help mitigate flooding by absorbing surface water and recharging groundwater. It's through this process that forest soils also provide clean water. Forest vegetation provides shade, which is crucial for cooling down streams, riparian habitat, and populated spaces. So it's really difficult to be precise with predictions and changing temperature and moisture regimes, especially at a finer scale. And it's difficult to attribute certain changes specifically to climate change. There are varying predictions on the relative proportions of species like maple, poplar, and oak, all of which consume water at different rates and will handle variable precipitation differently. But changes in forest types are most clear-cut when it comes to the future of the high elevation spruce fir forests, which I'll talk about momentarily. The climate whiplash I mentioned in the last slide of precipitation hydrology poses a considerable threat to forest health and the survival of certain species. Think about the threats that the forest may currently face. This includes pests, storm damage, wildfires, and competition between species. We can expect climate change to exacerbate many of these threats, leading to a more exacerbated death by 1,000 cuts kind of effect. When forests must deal with extreme fluctuations in water, they become less resilient to other threats. So therefore, that helps ensue that death by 1,000 cuts effect. Under normal conditions, forests are resilient to all these threats. They can bounce back. However, under extreme variations in temperature and precipitation, this resilience falters. Specifically, drought-stressed trees can be more susceptible to pest attacks, such as those from the balsam and hemlock woody adelgid, emerald ash borer, and southern pine beetle. Warming temperatures present a double whammy because not only are trees becoming less resilient to these pests, at the same time, warming temperatures create more favorable conditions for these pests for a greater period of time. Essentially, more warm days in a year gives these pests more time to breed, and this allows them to undergo potentially multiple life cycles within 1 year. And given the projected increased risk of drought, there may also be corresponding increase in wildfire risk during dry periods, which also weakens these trees. Essentially, everything here is kind of cyclical and feeds into each other. And so all of these threats will result in hindered forest health and productivity. And since forests are so essential to providing ecosystem services like clean water and flood protection, climate impacts to forests are thus impacts to our drinking water sources and flood buffers. Moving on to high elevation mountains. High elevation mountains are incredibly important environments in the southern Appalachian Mountains. The climatic conditions up here, including lower temperatures and higher moisture, make the environment much more resilient to the effects of climate change, namely the warming impacts. And this is because they contain microclimates. And these are basically pockets of habitat that are buffered from climate change impacts. And I'll talk more at length about the importance of these specialized environments later. Anyway, resilience is a bit paradoxical here, because despite having relatively cool temperatures and distinctive landforms and rock outcrops that can help create those little pockets of microclimates, the ecosystems up here are actually pretty sensitive because they're quite specialized and they depend on the special conditions of those microclimates. And this includes both the spruce fir forests and the grassy and heath balds. And the area in terms of the SAHC's conservation focus areas, talking more about like the Rhone Highlands, which is kind of the flagship program of SAHC. So going back to climate change impacts, there's pretty much unanimous consensus in the literature that climate change will impact the ranges of the southeastern spruce fir forests, and this puts them at risk of disappearance. And this is because these forests are already so isolated, confined to the highest elevations in the southeast. They also have a history of disturbance from improper forest management and also from historical destruction by the balsam woody adelgid. And right now, they face competition from faster growing hardwood and herbaceous species that do better in warmer temperatures. I'm sure we've all seen the blackberry bushes that can be encroaching on these ecosystems. And going back to the pest problem, as I mentioned before, warmer temperatures also encourage pest survival and reproduction, and models suggest that this may apply to the balsam woody adelgid. Moreover, literature also shows that warmer temperatures will reduce the frequency of cloud immersion at these elevations, and this cloud immersion is a really important source of water for both the balds and the spruce fir forests. The balds contain a lot of extremely specialized and endemic species like G. radiatum and Gray's lily. It's difficult to know how these species will respond to changes in climate. On one hand, because they're already quite hardy, they may do okay. On the other hand, erratic changes in moisture and temperature may harm them because they're adapted to such a specific environment. Moving on to wildfire and severe weather risks. The extreme precipitation patterns I discussed earlier are associated with landslides and floods, and these are especially damaging for rural communities that may not have the infrastructure to quickly recover from these hazards. Going on to drought and wildfires, the Southern Appalachians are not really known for wildfires. We usually associate these with the West Coast because here in the Southern Appalachians, this area is known for being quite wet and moist, almost like a temperate rainforest. That said, climate models still predict that warming air temperatures will likely increase regional drying, as water stored in vegetation and soils is increasingly evaporated and transpired into the atmosphere. Remember that drought and dry periods are still an endemic part of Southern Appalachian ecosystems. Drier conditions and drier vegetation will likely increase wildfire risk across the Southern Appalachians. What compounds the risk of wildfires, landslides, and floods is the expansion of something called the wildland-urban interface, or the WUI. And this is defined as the area where homes and communities meet or intermingle with undeveloped wildland vegetation. Wildfires that occur in the WUI can be extremely dangerous or destructive to lives and property. And as development pushes into wild areas, the WUI expands and more people are exposed to natural hazards. So this discussion feeds partially into the effects on cities, towns, and other developed areas. As it might be clear, the Southern Appalachians are undergoing quite a bit of population growth and development. It's really exploding. This is partly because the area is awesome, but also because the area is buffered from many of the climate change impacts that are currently manifesting across the country. As a result, there is an anticipated climate migration pattern of people into this area from these more adversely affected states like Utah, California, New Mexico, Arizona, those states that are all on fire, etc. So I want to delve into the point of development and climate change feeding into each other. And we're especially going to see this in the future. And what this means is that essentially, as more people move into the area, more development will be required to help house and provide for these people. And of course, people need places to live. But at the same time, if we want to continue to preserve the natural resources that help us survive and bring us so much joy and foster biodiversity, we will need to focus on protecting the most threatened, sensitive, and valuable ecosystems and environments. And lastly, another thing I want to note is the uniqueness of urban areas in a changing climate. An example of an issue especially prevalent in urban and more developed areas is flooding, especially in developed floodplains and impermeable surfaces. And SAHC is actually working with the Haywood Waterways Association to help bolster flood resilience in the Upper Pigeon River. Another unique urban issue is heat islands. These are and these stem from a lack of natural shade and forests, but of shade by forests and cooling by water bodies. And this highlights the importance of conserving land that is proximal to developed areas. Moving on to farmland and local food security. So farmland in the Southern Appalachians also faces the dual threat of development and climate change. Small family farms are a cornerstone of Southern Appalachian natural and cultural heritage. They're an important source of local agriculture and they contribute to food security in the region. However, along with other factors, development pressure is already development pressure is displacing these farms at a staggering rate. And through its Farmland program, SAHC already does a lot of work to protect small family farms from development pressure. Areas that are easy and attractive for development may share many common characteristics with farmland. And these include notable features like gentle terrain, easy access to roads, and proximity to water bodies. So this means that family farms are at higher risk of development. And this is especially true as farming families age and pass their land on to younger generations, because these younger generations may not want to continue operating these farms. I mean, farming is an extremely tough profession and it's not as lucrative as other means of income, like say, selling off your land. In the Southern Appalachians, every acre of farmland matters. Given the terrain here, a very small amount of farmland is prime soil. And once these soils are lost to development, they're ruined. They're gone forever. And this diminishes the amount of food that can be grown locally. So it's apparent that even without climate change, family farms are greatly at risk of disappearing, and climate change actually builds on all of these threats in multiple ways. First, climate change is making farming riskier and less lucrative by presenting farmers with an intensifying and increasingly unpredictable regime of natural hazards, namely those precipitation extremes and temperature extremes I discussed earlier. Unpredictable or decreased crop yield means that farmers will have to take more risks on their finances and livelihoods. Second, as I said before, climate change and development feed into each other. So population growth catalyzed by climate migration inevitably creates more demand for development, including development on farmland. For those that do choose to continue farming or choose to become farmers in the Southern Appalachians, a sustainable and climate-conscious best management practices will be crucial. So essentially, farmers will need to focus on how to make their land more resilient to changing erratic precipitation and climate regimes. So I just spent all this time talking about our impending climate doom, but that's not the only purpose of why I'm here today. A significant part of the action plan delineates the different forms of climate action and weaves these actions into the work that SAHC currently does to protect and conserve land throughout the Southern Appalachians. I also discuss recommendations for how SAHC can continue building upon this work with climate change as a conservation priority. Broadly, when planning for climate change, SAHC seeks to follow these guiding principles. SAHC already engages in many of these actions, and this plan codifies these guiding principles and illustrates how SAHC is currently engaging in this work and how it can amplify these actions. So these guiding principles are as follows: anticipating uncertainty with adaptive management, referring to up-to-date science and information, using resources like the Land Trust Alliance's Conservation in a Changing Climate Library, preserving abiotic diversity, which I'll explain momentarily, because abiotically diverse areas are more biologically diverse and home to the wildlife we need to protect. It's also important to recognize and respond to local concerns, asking people who actually live in these areas what they need and want. It's also important to recognize the interconnectedness of and within ecological and social systems. And lastly, communicating climate change to build trust with stakeholders, including landowners, farmers, and community members, is always crucial. So going into climate change actions, first, I'll start with mitigation. Climate mitigation refers to actions taken to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere or prevent greenhouse gases from entering the atmosphere in the first place. Mitigation can be achieved with technology, but recent landmark research by the Nature Conservancy has shown that nature is amazing at mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. The various ways by which natural systems, namely biomass and soil, store or capture greenhouse gases that would otherwise be released into the atmosphere are termed natural climate solutions. Preventing land conversion is critical because land conversion is a significant source of carbon emissions. So when you dig up a landscape for development, not only are you releasing carbon in the process, all that carbon stored in the soil and biomass, you're also decreasing or eliminating the potential of the new landscape to mitigate future emissions. And following land protection, proper management and restoration methods are essential for maintaining a landscape's health and helping it realize its full potential in mitigating atmospheric carbon. Research by the Nature Conservancy has shown that a wide variety of ecosystems and landscapes can mitigate carbon. Here in the Southern Appalachians, forests and farmland are the most relevant here. So the majority of SAHC's protected lands are forested. It's been observed that mature forests are particularly good at storing carbon. So protecting forests and allowing them to continue growing increases the area of mature forests across SAHC's conservation focus areas. And with proper stewardship, SAHC helps keep these forests healthy and productive, and therefore better able to store carbon. And the same concept applies to cultivated and working lands. In other words, farmland. A significant amount of carbon is stored in agricultural land. Irresponsible management of farmland can contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, but best management practices such as regenerative agriculture and agroforestry can help enhance carbon mitigation potential. And SAHC currently works with its farmers, both with easements and in its farmer incubation program, to better manage farmland with these best management practices. I want to take a second to talk about carbon markets and carbon finance. Some land trusts have engaged in carbon markets. They sell carbon credits and use the revenue to fund other projects. The Nature Conservancy, which is a huge organization and also technically a land trust, actually does a lot of this. But for small land trusts that work with a lot of small landowners, there can be a lot of limitations and barriers to entry. It's also pretty difficult to intentionally manage for carbon because the truth is foresters and forest economists don't yet understand how many of the important logistics work. Also, just because you manage a forest to capture carbon effectively doesn't mean it'll be good for other conservation priorities like biodiversity and resilience to natural hazards and climate extremes. For my research, I spoke with the forestry nonprofit eco-foresters about the feasibility of managing forests for carbon. And this conversation mostly just solidified my understanding that this is such a tricky space to work in, especially for smaller stakeholders. For now, it's important to ensure that forests are able to withstand and bounce back from climate extremes. Moving on to climate adaptation. So when changes occur in a species environment, species have three options. They can move, meaning they can migrate to a different place where conditions resemble those that they are adapted to. Species can adapt to changing conditions, or the species can die. So unable to migrate or adapt, species may become extirpated or locally extinct. And research has shown that all three of these adaptations are occurring in response to climate change across many, many species. But these responses vary by species. Some species are unable to adapt in place, and some, like trees, migrate quite slowly. Research has also shown that many species are already migrating in response to climate change, most notably northwards and upslope, where temperatures are cooler. And you can see this on this cool migrations in motion map, which shows different kinds of species all moving upward and towards higher. They're kind of coalescing, interestingly, towards the Appalachian mountain chain. So moving on, there's this concept called conserving the stage, which is termed by the Nature Conservancy. So recognizing the landscapes where species are likely to migrate to, and conserving these landscapes for the future creates habitat corridors along which species can migrate to more habitable conditions. It also protects current habitats and helps facilitate long-term survival and adaptations. Much research has revealed that the diversity of life, biodiversity, is fostered by diversity in abiotic conditions, essentially the landforms, soils, and unique environmental features upon which organisms thrive. To incorporate biodiversity into land protection, it's important to prioritize and conserve landscapes that contain this abiotic diversity that can house a lot of different kinds of species that are migrating. And adaptation is a pathway to resilience. Climate resilience refers to how well a system, an ecosystem, or a community landscape can bounce back from disturbance. Ecosystems are naturally designed to bounce back from these disturbances and adapt to future changes over time. But as I discussed earlier, we can expect to see a drastic rise in the pace and severity of these disturbances. Essentially, climate change is happening faster than species can adapt. The adaptation measures I discussed are a pathway to resilience in an era of climate change. Ecosystems now need human initiative to help adapt to all of these changes, or else they may succumb to disturbances and not recover. And these are some questions that roughly guide resilience goals and conservation in the conservation planning process. Like, what's our role in facilitating these adaptations? How do we help ecosystems prepare for remarkable and rapid change? And then there's also the question of how do we incorporate these strategies into holistic conservation planning? What does this look like at the parcel scale, which is how land protection and a land trust really works? It's really important to note that it's challenging to manage for everything simultaneously, especially if goals conflict or if conservation goals change over time in response to changing human or ecological needs. So, sorry, one second. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about how climate change is being addressed through SAHC's 4 strategic goals: protecting, stewarding, connecting, and growing. So as I said before, SAHC's historical work has inherently contributed to climate change actions, including mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. And the following slides delineate this a bit more. And I'll also discuss a bit how SAHC has started to actively address climate change in its recent work and how it can build upon this work going forward. So first off is protect, land protection. And land protection is inherently mitigative because protected lands cannot be converted, and this helps to keep carbon in the ground. SAHC has protected over 80,000 acres of land, much of it forested, and this saves it from conversion and hence all the carbon that would, hence keeping all the carbon that would be released upon conversion to development in the ground. The top image here shows roughly the amount of carbon stored in forest soils and biomass. It's a very rough map, but it'll have to do for now. The purple outline shows SAHC's 6 conservation focus areas, and you can see that much of these focal areas lie within the very green area, which represents a relatively high concentration of stored carbon. Moreover, SAHC's land protection efforts contribute to climate change adaptation. The land protection team works to prioritize parcels that will help species adapt to climate change, and parcels that are critical to providing ecosystem services and help buffer them from impacts like flooding and water shortage. The bulk of SAHC's properties cover areas defined by the Nature Conservancy as climate resilient, meaning that they are climate refugia, have a lot of that abiotic diversity, or provide habitat corridors for species that will need to migrate to more suitable climates. So the bottom image shows these Nature Conservancy defined climate resilience areas. So you can see that SAHC's conservation focus areas are again in this very green, very resilient areas. And the yellow and red areas describe those areas that aren't as climate resilient. So going forward, it may be necessary to construct climate responsive easements. Broadly, this would mean more actively anticipating things like natural disasters and species response to changing temperatures and precipitation regimes. So essentially, if all of these things happen on a landowner's easement, then inevitably the landowner will be affected because they are in part responsible for managing that easement. So climate responsive easements would entail working with these landowners to make sure that they are prepared for these changes and they're protected from any unanticipated liabilities. It may be necessary to further refine the parcel prioritization models that SAHC uses to select parcels for protection, because it's difficult to manage for so many priorities at once. Lastly, it's also important to ask ourselves, what will an ecosystem need in future decades, in future centuries? It's definitely a difficult question to grapple with, but broadly, much of the answer lies in protecting these very climate resilient areas. Next up is stewardship. Through its stewardship work, SAHC commits to responsible, science-based management based on the unique conservation values of each of its properties. In the context of climate change, managing these properties bolsters the health and resilience of ecosystems to withstand disturbances and extremes caused by climate change. SAHC's flagship conservation program in the Rhone Highlands plays into the organization's climate change action plan. Because as high elevation, cooler habitats, these areas are climate refugia for species migrating upslope. Moreover, the ecosystems of the Rhone Highlands are highly sensitive and generally need as much protection as possible from human disturbances and development pressure, so that people can continue enjoying these landscapes. And this map is an example of one of the habitat corridors that SAHC intentionally manages. It's a more connected habitat of spruce fir forests throughout the Rhone Highlands. On SAHC protected properties and easements, planting more red spruce trees and treating forests for pests fosters resilience and helps create habitat for more vulnerable species. SAHC helps manage the Spruce Fir Restoration Project as part of the Southern Appalachian Spruce Restoration Initiative, which is a partnership of nonprofit and government organizations that aim to restore the spruce fir forests across high elevation mountains. And projects like these can be quite resource intensive and require long-term monitoring, which is why collaborations like these are so important. These monitoring efforts inform both SAHC's goals for its stewardship projects, as well as projects that are part of a wider effort to continuously monitor ecosystems across the region. Going forward, these collaborative monitoring projects can be tailored to ask more targeted questions about climate impacts. SAHC lands can be used as a living laboratory for research into these localized climate impacts. Next up is connect. Climate change is a polarizing topic. The term can incite a variety of emotions from anxiety to confusion and anger. When connecting people with climate change, it's helpful to discuss the tangible impacts that people feel, see, and experience. For example, farmers may notice changes in the growing seasons, and those who enjoy fishing will notice how changes in stream temperature affect trout populations. It's important to ask ourselves how climate change will impact the things we love, like fishing, hiking, and gardening. Engaging people in outdoor recreation and outreach activities, like SAHC does, fosters a sense of place and connection to the land. As I said before, SAHC leads things like guided hikes, volunteering events, and like the Grassy Ridge Mow-Off and community farm tours. Outreach activities like these help build strong relationships where people can engage in meaningful discussion. Impacts from climate change can directly shape SAHC's initiatives to connect people with the land. For example, population pressures we've already discussed may contribute to visitor overuse impacts in popular trails, like Carver's Gap on the AT, and studies have shown that climate change is related to increases in tick populations and spread of disease, which will inevitably impact the people who visit these areas. SAHC may find pressures from climate change lead to the need to modify or create new experiences to connect people with nature. And I want to highlight this quote that I got from Jay Lloydsey, who's the SAHC senior advisor to the board. He says that it's important to make a human connection between people's values and changes in their own lives, and use these observations to guide what conservation needs to look like in the future. The last strategic goal is continuing to grow SAHC as a successful and sustainable organization. And this entails lowering the organization's carbon footprint through practices like remote monitoring, for example, for properties that are quite far away, and working from home. The SAHC office and community farm are also equipped with solar panels that provide renewable energy. Importantly, the SAHC community farm, which is used as an educational space for the public and for farmers that participate in SAHC's farming program, it's sustained with sustainable best management practices that help facilitate carbon mitigation. For example, regenerative agriculture and adaptation, for example, agroforestry. And in refining these strategic goals and how climate change fits into continuing to shape them over the course of time, adaptive management and monitoring and evaluation are important strategies for helping to refine these goals and approaches. Adaptive management is defined by the Department of the Interior as a structured approach to decision-making that emphasizes accountability and explicitness in decision-making. Adaptive management is cyclical, and change is acknowledged as a constant. The flexibility of adaptive management corresponds perfectly to the unpredictability of climate change. Climate vulnerability assessments can inform land management strategies that target these vulnerabilities. Evaluating the results of these strategies can help inform any necessary modifications to iteratively address problems going forward. So this strategy is still a pretty broad approach. So it's important to use data and observations to shape an adaptive management framework. This involves keeping track of both environmental and social changes that are incurred by climate change impacts, in addition to the effectiveness of SAHC's responses and actions to these changes. Of course, this is a very long-term process, taking place likely over several years or decades. Gathering data can be quite intensive, so partnerships with institutions, universities, and agencies are essential in collecting and tracking these data. Moving forward, given the rapid changes in climate change science and management guidance, this action plan should be periodically revisited and revised based on significant changes. Periodic monitoring and evaluation can help SAHC track ecological and social responses to its actions, and these evaluations can inform changes and adaptations in its management strategies. Partnering with other organizations and institutions with the resources to carry out monitoring and evaluation, for example, of grazed lily, is something that SAHC already does. These strategies can be tailored to answer questions about locally specific impacts of climate change. Many other land trusts across the country already engage quite intensively in climate change actions. So it's important to connect with these land trusts and learn what works, what doesn't work, and why their actions may or may not work. And I just want to note that the Land Trust Rally, which happened a couple of weeks ago, is a nationwide land trust conference run by the Land Trust Alliance. The theme this year was climate change. And I heard that Jay Lloydsey and another, one of the SAHC board members had the opportunity to attend that. Next, as with any environmental management project, the stakeholders who actually interact with and depend on these natural resources and are affected by climate impacts should be listened to and their needs taken into account. An example of this for land trusts would be accounting for unpredictable climate change-induced difficulties farmers might face while managing a conservation easement. All the while, again, as I said at the very beginning, it's critical to communicate climate change thoughtfully. It's a charged term and a charged subject. I want to close out with this quote by Stewardship Associate Chris Cossey. SAHC's mission hasn't changed, but as a local land management organization, the onus is on us to respond to climate change. We must also articulate climate change to the surrounding community and communicating a formulated idea of how our organization fits into the broader picture. So with that, here are some acknowledgements for the people who helped make this happen, and for the resources I turned to when outlining my action plan. So thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate your time and attention today. I will take questions.
Claire, thank you so much for that really comprehensive and analytical look at climate issues and how we can play a more significant role in mitigating the effects. The action plan really will help guide our work and how we evolve to try to meet the challenges effectively as we can, and then to tell the story and communicate about climate change and how land trusts can make a difference. We really are grateful to you for just an outstanding job this summer, and in this webinar you really have outlined the topic so well. So we are, if folks on the webinar would like to ask questions, we would love to have a dialogue about the topic. Looks like a question popped up from Jamie in the Q&A. And Jamie's asking about the transcript or recording. And so we are going to put that together and make it available. And Angela, you may have the most thorough answer to how we're going to make it available.
Yeah, so it should be finished processing by tomorrow to put on our YouTube channel, and we're going to work on putting it together onto a page with a brief devised from Claire's plan on our website. So you can look on the YouTube channel by tomorrow. It should be posted there. That'll be the first accessible point.
If someone would like to read the full action plan itself, can they reach out to us and maybe we can email a PDF? Is that possible too?
Yes, you can reach out sahc@appalachian.org. Just send me an email and I'll facilitate that.
Great. Well, thank you everybody who's joined the webinar, and again, panelists, thank you so much, and Claire, thanks for your work. We will have additional lunch and learn webinars going forward, and I think our next one is scheduled for next month on the 27th at noon, and that will be a look at bats in the Southern Appalachians with Kyle Shute, who's SAHC's Land Protection Associate. So again, thanks everybody, and look forward to seeing you next time. It looks like there's one more question. Well, actually just a comment. Excellent presentation, Claire, and couldn't agree more. So thanks everybody, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon. Bye-bye.